The women on the porch were the first thing anyone noticed about the ranch, and the last thing anyone understood. 3 of them, seated close enough that their skirts brushed, yet each carrying her own silence like a private wound. They watched the yard with practiced calm, eyes sharp, mouths still. You could tell how long a woman had lived there by how little she moved. The newest ones fidgeted. These 3 did not. When the girl stepped off the wagon, boots touching dirt that felt harder than it should have been, they looked at her the way people look at a clock that's already run out. One leaned forward just enough for the girl to smell soap and sweat and something bitter, like old coffee burned black. "Listen close," the woman whispered, not unkindly, not gentle either. "Sex is the first rule here." The words weren't offered as temptation. They were delivered like weather, like a fact you dressed yourself around if you wanted to survive. The girl nodded because nodding cost nothing, and because asking questions in places like this had a way of shortening lives. She stood there, dust on her hem, hands folded so tight her knuckles went pale. She had practiced confidence on the road west, rehearsed it with every mile, but the ranch stripped that away in seconds. This place didn't care who she pretended to be. It only cared whether she could last. The women's eyes followed her as she crossed the yard, each step measured, as if the ground itself might object to her presence. Somewhere behind the barn, metal clicked softly. A rifle being set down or picked up. She didn't turn around. She'd learned early that some movements invited trouble. Stillness, when chosen carefully, could pass for strength. The man appeared without ceremony. He didn't ride in. He didn't call out. He simply stood where the yard narrowed, framed by a post and the edge of the corral, like he'd always been there and she was the late one. He wore his years plainly. No wasted gestures. No need to announce himself. His hat sat low, shadow cutting his face in half, leaving only his mouth visible. It wasn't smiling. It wasn't angry. It was set in a line that suggested decisions had already been made long before this moment. The girl felt her heart begin to argue with her ribs, each beat loud enough she was sure he could hear it. She thought of the letter folded in her bag, the promise of work written in careful ink. She thought of the road behind her and the men she'd outrun to get here. None of that mattered now. The women didn't look at the man. They didn't need to. They had learned how to read him without lifting their heads. The girl realized then that whatever rules existed here, they weren't written down. They were learned by watching, by surviving long enough to understand what silence meant, what a pause meant, what a look held back meant. The man took a step closer. The dust didn't stir. He stopped at a distance that felt deliberate, far enough to show restraint, close enough to show control. "You're late," he said. Not an accusation, an observation. His voice was lower than she expected, steady, like a hand placed flat on a table. "I had trouble on the trail," the girl said. It was the truth, trimmed down to fit the moment. And she didn't explain what kind of trouble. She didn't say whose hands had grabbed her reins or whose breath she'd smelled too close. This man didn't need the details. Men like him either already knew or didn't want to know at all. He studied her boots, then her hands, then her face. When his eyes finally met hers, she felt the urge to look away and fought it down. Looking away was the fastest way to be dismissed. Or worse. "You can stay," he said after a moment. The pause before his words did more work than the words themselves. "Or you can turn around." He nodded toward the road, faint in the distance, already starting to disappear under drifting dust. There was no pressure in his voice. That scared her. Men who forced things announced themselves loudly. Men who offered choices often believed they were already in charge. And the girl thought of the women on the porch, the whisper that had settled in her bones. She thought of the certainty she'd felt the moment she saw him, that if he decided she was a problem, there would be no argument, no mercy, no story left to tell. She stayed because fear is sometimes the truest compass a person has. She stayed because the road behind her held men who smiled too easily. She stayed because something in the way he stood suggested rules, and rules meant order, and order, however hard, could be learned. The women didn't react when she chose. They shifted just enough to make room for her later, not now. Acceptance here came in inches, not welcomes. The man turned away, already done with the moment, already trusting her to follow or not. She followed. Each step felt like a small surrender. Inside the house, the air smelled of leather and old wood and something medicinal. The kind of place where wounds were cleaned quickly and forgotten just as fast. He gestured to a chair. She didn't sit until he did. When he finally removed his hat, she saw the scar at his hairline, pale and clean, like it had healed properly but never fully disappeared. A reminder left on purpose. "You work," he said. "You listen. You don't lie." His eyes stayed on her face as he spoke, like he was measuring how much of her would break under those words. "What you earn, you keep. What's mine, stays mine." He hesitated, just a fraction. "What happens here stays here." The girl nodded again. Her throat felt tight. She wondered which rule would be the hardest. She wondered which rule would save her life. Outside, the women rose as one and moved off the porch, her skirts whispering against the boards. They had done their part. The warning had been given. What happened next was between the girl and the land, between the girl and the man who owned it. As she stepped back into the light, the ranch seemed larger than before, stretched out and waiting, patient in a way only unforgiving places could afford to be. The girl told herself she would last a month, then 2, long enough to gather strength, long enough to choose again. She did not know yet that choices, once made, have a way of changing the people who make them. And before this story goes any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The ranch did not announce mourning with kindness. It announced it with routine. The girl learned this on her first full day, when a bell rang once, only once, and every sound that followed seemed to fall into line behind it. Boots on wood, a kettle set down too hard, the soft groan of a gate opening. Nobody told her where to stand. Nobody explained what came next. They expected her to watch, to notice, to adapt. The women moved with purpose, not speed. Speed belonged to panic. Purpose belonged to survival. The girl took her place beside them without being invited, hands already aching from work she had not yet done. Reed did not hover. He gave instructions the way he gave choices: short, clean, final. Feed before sunup. Fence by midday. Water counted twice in dry weeks. He spoke to her as if she already knew the rules, and somehow that made her try harder to learn them. Fear kept her careful. Pride kept her standing. She noticed how Reed never stood with his back to open space, how his eyes tracked movement even when he seemed to be listening to something else. She noticed the way the other women watched him too, not with longing, not with resentment, but with something closer to calculation. They trusted him to be consistent. In places like this, consistency mattered more than kindness. At night, the ranch settled into a quiet that felt earned. The girl lay on her narrow bed, listening to sounds she didn't yet have names for. The distant scrape of an animal moving where it shouldn't. The low crack of wood cooling after heat. Somewhere beyond the house, Reed cleaned his gun. The sound was careful, almost reverent. Metal against cloth. A rhythm that never rushed. She wondered who he expected to use it on. She wondered if she would hear it fired before she heard her own name spoken with any warmth. Sleep came in pieces, each one ending before it could feel safe. Days stacked themselves neatly. Work left no room for imagination, and that was a relief. She learned how to move without drawing attention, how to finish tasks without asking for approval. The women spoke to her more now, in small, practical sentences. Where to stand when horses spooked. How to wrap cloth tight enough to stop bleeding but loose enough to keep feeling. Which corners of the ranch caught wind, and which held heat like a secret. No one repeated the rule whispered on her first day. It didn't need repeating. It lived in the air, understood rather than enforced. And yet, Reed never crossed that line. And he kept distance like it was a habit he'd practiced for years. That distance frightened her in a new way. Men who wanted something were predictable. Men who wanted nothing were harder to read. It was near the end of the second week when the rider came. He arrived loud, horse-lathered and angry, dust hanging around him like proof of speed. The ranch stiffened at the sound. Reed was at the fence when he heard it. He didn't move right away. He finished tying the wire, pulled it tight, and only then turned. The girl watched his hands. They were steady. His eyes were not. The rider called out a name Reed hadn't answered in years. The sound of it landed heavy, like something dug up that should have stayed buried. The women drifted back toward the house without being told. This wasn't for them. The rider spoke fast, their words tumbling over each other like he needed to get them out before courage ran dry. He talked about a dry arroyo, about a marker that never stayed upright, about a woman who waited too long for a man who never came back. The girl understood enough to feel the shift before Reed did anything to show it. The past had found him. It had ridden hard and straight and didn't intend to leave quietly. Reed's jaw tightened. For the first time since she'd arrived, he looked older than the land around him. He didn't deny the story. He didn't correct it either. When the rider finished, Reed nodded once, slow and final, and told him to go. The rider left with relief written into his shoulders. Reed stayed where he was long after the sound of hooves faded. The girl hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to step back or stay. But he didn't look at her when she approached. He sat down in the dirt like his legs had forgotten how to hold him. The girl brought him water without thinking. Her hands shook when she offered it. He took it anyway. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the fear she'd carried since the day she arrived shifted shape. This man could kill her, yes, but he was also carrying something heavier than a rifle. "I won't hurt you," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It sounded like a promise he'd failed before and didn't want to fail again. After that night, things changed without announcement. Reed spoke more. Not about his past, but about the land. He showed her how to read tracks, how to tell when weather would turn before the sky admitted it. He taught her to ride without pulling the reins too hard, to let the horse decide when it could. But trust, he explained, wasn't a gift. It was a habit. She learned his silences too, when to stop talking, when to wait, when to stand her ground. The women watched these lessons from a distance, curious but not interfering. They had their own reasons for staying. She was beginning to understand hers. One evening, a storm pressed close, thunder low and steady, like a warning given early. The girl found Reed in the barn, oiling a hinge that didn't need oil. He was nervous. She could see it now. She told him her real name. It slipped out before she could stop it, fragile and true. He didn't repeat it. He just nodded, accepting the weight of it without claiming ownership. That mattered more than she knew how to explain. Fear didn't leave all at once. It loosened, slow and cautious. And in that space, something else began to grow. Something neither of them had planned for, something neither of them knew how to name yet. Fear never left all at once. It thinned the way fog does, quietly, unevenly, retreating from some places while clinging hard to others. The girl noticed it first in small moments, in the way her shoulders no longer rose at every sudden sound, in how she could walk across the yard at dusk without counting her steps, in how Reed's presence stopped feeling like a threat she had to measure and started feeling like a fact she could lean against. Not comfort, exactly, something sturdier, something earned. The other women began to leave when the season turned. One took her wages and followed a cattle drive south, saying she wanted noise and a town that never slept. Another left before dawn with a man who promised her a store and a name that would belong to her. The third stayed longer, watching the girl closely, like she was trying to decide whether to warn her or congratulate her. When she finally left, she pressed a folded scrap of paper into the girl's hand. It held no words, just a pressed wildflower, dry but still intact. The girl understood. Surviving a place didn't always mean escaping it. With fewer voices in the house, the nights grew quieter. Reed and the girl ate together now, the space between them no longer measured so carefully. He talked about practical things, repairs that needed doing, fences that wouldn't last another winter. Sometimes he spoke of nothing at all, just sat with his coffee cooling in his hands, eyes fixed somewhere past the walls. She learned when to let silence stand and when to break it. She learned that Reed listened better than he spoke, and when he spoke, it was because he meant it. The proposal didn't come with ceremony. It came on a day that felt ordinary, which somehow made it heavier. Reed had been mending a gate when he said it, like it was another task that needed doing before dark. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach for her. He just said her name, her real name, and asked if she would stay, not as a worker, not as someone passing through, but as his wife. His voice shook, and that shook her more than anything else ever had. She thought of the girl who had stepped off the wagon weeks ago, certain she would die here. She thought of the road behind her, of all the places that had taken pieces of her and given nothing back. And she said yes because staying was no longer an act of fear. It was a choice. Marriage didn't soften Reed overnight. It didn't turn the ranch into something gentle. But it changed the way they stood beside each other. He began to ask her opinion, not because he needed permission, but because he trusted her sight. She argued with him sometimes, quietly, carefully. And when he listened, really listened, she felt something inside her settle into place. They worked the land together side by side, learning each other's rhythms the way they'd learned the seasons. Love, she realized, wasn't loud. It was consistent. It showed up every morning and did the work. There were moments when the past reached for them, men who remembered Reed differently. Stories that traveled faster than truth. Once, a stranger came looking for trouble. A drunk on old grudges and louder than sense. Reed handled it without violence. his voice steady, his hands open. The girl stood behind him, not hiding, not interfering. The stranger left confused, his anger finding no place to land. That night, Reed admitted he'd been afraid. Afraid of becoming the man he used to be, afraid of proving the stories right. She told him fear didn't mean failure. It meant care. He believed her. Time moved forward the way it always does, whether people are ready or not. The ranch changed slowly. Repairs held. Crops took better. Laughter returned to the house in unexpected bursts, surprising both of them when it happened. The girl, no, the woman now, sometimes thought about the whisper on the porch, the rule that had once defined this place. It no longer fit. Rules, she had learned, and only last as long as the people who believe in them. This ranch believed in something else now. Not perfection, not safety, but honesty. And that was enough. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you uneasy or hopeful, or both at once, take a moment with that feeling. How would you have responded to fear dressed as opportunity? Would you have stayed? Would you have trusted someone with a past heavy enough to cast long shadows? And if someone chose you not because they had to, but because they wanted to, how would that change the way you saw yourself? Thank you for staying to the end. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd truly love to hear your thoughts.